hose under here. Okay, I think we'll get started. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. As usual, welcome. I'm Wendy Worden, the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library's Programs and Services Coordinator. And Fireside is in its 32nd season in partnership with the St. Paul Public Library. And this is our final program of January. And thank you for being here with us for this run, because I've needed the neurosystem reset of being here with you, and I hope it's done that for you as well. Fireside is made possible in part through the voters of Minnesota, through grants from the Metropolitan Regional Arts Council, thanks to a legislative appropriation from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, and an appropriation from the Minnesota State Legislature to the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library as the Minnesota Center for the Book. We've got books for sale this evening from Black Garnet, located on University Avenue. You could talk to me afterwards about those. I will be happy to send you home with a book. Speaking of books, I want to extend a special welcome to Carrie Fink, who is representing the Friends Development Team with us tonight. We have launched the Books for All St. Paul campaign. We believe in celebrating the stories of Minnesotans and ensuring our library's collection reflects our entire community. And Carrie would love to speak with you after the event if you have not already done so. I see so many folks who've been with us this whole month, so it's great. We are grateful again for your support here this evening. I would like to introduce you then to Greg. He's a historian whose career has included 2 decades of teaching at a liberal arts college and a decade of work as an historic preservation consultant, primarily preparing National Register of Historic Places nominations around the state of Minnesota, with his wife and co-author, Marcia Neff, who is joining us tonight. Hi, Marcia.
Marcia.
He was a frequent contributor to Minnesota history, and 2 of their articles won the David Gebhard Award for Best Article on Minnesota's Built Environment. He holds a doctorate in modern European and Russian history from the University of Minnesota, and he's here tonight to speak to us about a fascinating period of Minnesota history. So welcome, Greg.
Thank you very much, Wendy. And thanks to the Friends, and especially to Wendy for organizing this event. And also I have to thank the Minnesota Historical Society for sponsoring some of my research and for obviously publishing the book. And I think, doing a really nice job putting it together. I really appreciate it. And the many librarians and archivists who helped me along the way. Wendy's already mentioned my wife, Marcia Neff, who's a frequent co-author and obviously helped me through this whole very long process. I think we figured 12 years. Is that what we figured how long I've been working? No. Yeah.
Looking down at that. No, it's up higher.
No, I think it's okay. All right. I'll hold them up. Okay. So I think of this project as building on the work of a lot of other historians who've gone before, who've worked in this area, talking about what happened, some remarkable things that happened in Minnesota during World War I. And I really want to kind of acknowledge them too. What I would ask you to do, if you pick up a copy of the book, or for that matter, any book, look at the acknowledgments section. One of the most important parts of any book, although not often looked at by a lot of people, and there you'll see some of the people I'm talking about that I really feel like I'm working, based on what they've already done. Now, I have to say that when I wrote this book, I thought that I was documenting a uniquely bad moment in Minnesota's history, when Minnesota kind of veered off the tracks into authoritarianism and democratic norms were abandoned. And it turns out, unfortunately, I was very wrong. But I still hope that taking time to explore this period and to see how what happened with democracy in 1917 and 1918, how it was derailed, but also how people resisted that, will still be of some value, even though things have actually gotten worse than I ever anticipated. So this book is about those battles that raged in Minnesota during the war, what I call the war at home. Obviously the title of the book, when our state government was for a time, I argue, one of the most repressive, if not the most repressive in the entire country. I was interested in the impact this had on the state and also on the lives of individuals, and what led to this intense, sometimes violent war at home is what I was trying to get to. So to begin with, the hard part about writing a book about a locality, about, say, Minnesota, is that I think it doesn't really make any sense unless you really put it in a wider context. So contextualizing is obviously what historians are always trying to do. So I just want to mention a few things about what was happening in 1914 when the war broke out in Europe, and that was still going on in April of 1917 when the US finally entered the war. So just keep these things in mind. They're just very, I'm just going to mention them really briefly, but I think they will remind you of a lot of things. For one thing, in those years, the US was going through a jarring transition to a new stage of industrial capitalism, dominated by large corporations and trusts. Secondly, there was a mass migration going on from Europe to the US and a nativist backlash against that migration, right? Thirdly, there was the astounding economic inequality that had taken root during the Gilded Age. An economic inequality that apparently we've only now just gotten worse at, right? But nevertheless, that was what was happening. There was the rise of trade unionism, the industrial workers of the world, involved the trade unions. There were populist farmer organizations that had been organizing for many decades and were still at it. There was the rise of the Socialist Party, Debs. There was the great migration of African Americans from the South to the North. There was the rise of the NAACP and other organizations to fight Jim Crow, discrimination, and lynching. There was the final push of the women's suffrage movement for the vote. And finally, there was a movement for the prohibition of alcohol production and sale. All these things were going on in 1914. It was a busy time, and all those things were going on in Minnesota. And those transformations, those conflicts, didn't just grind to a halt because a war broke out in Europe. They continued. In many cases, they were intensified by the war. So when I was early in this research, I picked up a book by David Kennedy, a major historian, and he wrote a book about the home front during World War I in the United States on a national scale. And he called the book Over Here, which I thought was kind of a clever title, actually. So, and there, Americans went to war in 1917, not only against Germans in the field of France, but against each other at home. What happened on the home front, he said, was a deadly serious contest to determine the consequences of the crisis for the character of American economic, social, and political life. And I thought that sounded right, and it seemed to be especially true in Minnesota. What I found was that Minnesota was one of the hot spots of the war at home, the struggle for the home front, not only because of all those conflicts that I just mentioned that kept going on, but also because the war itself was controversial. So in the first part of the book, I chart this period, so-called period of neutrality, from the time when the European war began in July of 1914 and when the US entered the war in April of 1917. During the time, there was an intense debate in the US about whether the US should stay neutral or whether the US should enter the war against Germany. And in states like Minnesota, very much the majority view was for neutrality. Minnesota was a deeply polarized society in that period, but the majority view at that point would have been to stay out of the war. Nevertheless, the US went into the war and then Minnesota had to deal with. So here's what happens when we get to the story that I try to tell in this book. In March of 1917, that is to say, a month before the US declared war on Germany, when the US was just on the verge of being, everybody knew it, the leaders of the business community, especially in Minneapolis, but also in St. Paul, acted very quickly. They went to the legislature, which, by the way, was about to adjourn for a year because we had a biennial legislature at that time, and they got the legislature to pass a law creating what they called the Minnesota Commission for Public Safety. And this body was given the power to essentially run the state for the duration of the war. So they were concerned about this because they knew that when the war was declared, the Minnesota National Guard, for example, was going to be federalized and sent to France. And they thought of the Minnesota National Guard as their kind of last line of defense in a strike. And the National Guard was going to be gone. They wanted to figure out how they were going to deal with this problem. And so this elected body was, I should say this unelected body, had the governor, Joseph Burnquist, the attorney general, and 5 members appointed by the governor. So it was a 7-person commission. They were mostly conservative businessmen, and there was no one representing the trade unions or workers, no one representing farmers. This is the way it was set up. So why did the business community rush to the legislature to set up the Commissioner of Public Safety in the month before the war was beginning? We have to go back and think about this. The business community, especially in Minneapolis, was led by the big grain millers, the big banks, the manufacturers. They were highly unified, highly organized. They tended to have a common ethnic heritage. They were what we could call Yankees, that is to say, men of English or Scottish origin. They tended to worship in the same churches, Presbyterian, Episcopalian, Congregationalist. They lunched at the Minneapolis Club, which still exists, by the way. There it is, right downtown Minneapolis. And most importantly, they had formed organizations which were committed to keeping unions out of the state, or at least out of Minneapolis as much as they could, fighting for what they called the open shop. That is to say, a shop without a union contract. And they were very effective and very successful. But in 1916, the year before the U.S. entered the war, 3 things happened that shook them up. First, there was the rise of labor militancy, not only in the Twin Cities, but especially up on the Iron Range. There was a violent strike against U.S. Steel up on the Iron Range that was led by the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. It was suppressed with a lot of violence. The U.S. Steel hired 1,000 goons to break the strike. This is from a funeral march for a worker that was killed during the strike. You see it says, what does it say? Murdered by Oliver gunmen. So the Oliver was a subsidiary of U.S. Steel, one of the subsidiaries of U.S. Steel. So that was one thing that was shaking them up. And then after that strike was broken on the Iron Range, there was a second wildcat strike that broke out among the lumberjacks in the sawmills up north, also led by the IWW. So this was very troubling to the business leaders in the Twin Cities. Secondly, a socialist, can you believe this? A socialist was elected mayor of Minneapolis, Tom Van Leer. And so this is in 1916. So the Minneapolis mayor did not have a lot of power at that time, but he did have one particular power that was really important, which is that he appointed the police chief. And so now the business leaders are thinking, wait a minute, the National Guard's going to France, and a socialist is in charge of the police in Minneapolis? This can't be. This is terrible. Not to mention the fact that a socialist had won a mayor election on their own home turf was kind of really an insult to the business leaders. And so this was the second thing that really kind of bothered them. This had to be reversed in some ways. But the third thing that happened in 1916 was the worst. And that was symbolized by people like this guy. In 1916, a new farmer organization called the Nonpartisan League swept the elections in North Dakota. They won the governorship, they won the House, and a little bit later they won the Senate in North Dakota. And this was an organization of farmers that was essentially wheat farmers in North Dakota that felt really oppressed by the grain miller oligarchs in the Twin Cities. And they were trying to figure out a way to kind of even the playing field in terms of better market relations so that they would not be screwed so much by not only the grain millers, but also by the railroads. And they came on this idea, or a guy named Arthur Townley did, who was one of the farmers, to see if they could even that playing field by using the power of state government to create things like, say, a state bank that would give better credit terms to farmers, state elevators that would where they could store their grain at a better deal, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is what they did. And in North Dakota, they were successful. And you may know that the state bank that they created in North Dakota still exists. But having won the election in November 1916 in North Dakota, they immediately moved their national office to St. Paul and made very clear that they wanted to essentially do the same thing in Minnesota as soon as they possibly could. And so this was the worst thing from the business community's point of view, the Nonpartisan League, especially because of the success they had just had. So business leaders feared that once the war broke out, there was two possibilities. Either all these things could get worse from their point of view, or maybe they could use the war to reverse things and make it worse for all those of all their adversaries, trade unions, the IWW, the Nonpartisan League, et cetera. Now, the person who became the head of the Commission for Public Safety was a lawyer named John McGee. And he was a lawyer, a former judge, basically represented the railroads and the grain millers and that kind of thing. He was an extreme conservative, an extreme nationalist, and a bitter enemy of the unions, the Nonpartisan League, not to mention the Socialist Party and the IWW. Just to give you a kind of a taste of John McGee, there's lots in the book about John McGee, but just a little bit. In 1918, he was invited to Washington, D.C. to testify in Congress. A conservative senator had a bill in Congress to create military courts to try civilians for dissenting speech, because they were dissatisfied with the success they were having in the regular courts. So John McGee thought this was a great idea. Basically, he was into martial law from, as much as he possibly could. And here's what he said. This was his official testimony in Congress. Where we made a mistake was in not establishing a firing squad in the first days of the war. We should now get busy and have that firing squad working overtime. These men who are fighting against our soldiers this side of the water and stabbing them in the back are going to die. All socialists should be in internment camps. He said lots of things like this, but this is actually kind of remarkable because it was his actual formal testimony. So the state was set for conflict, and John McGee, I should say, became the de facto leader of the Commission for Public Safety. You might think the governor, who was also on the commission, would be the leader, but Governor Brinkus was only 34 years old, and John McGee was not only 20 years older than him, but also he was an extreme powerful personality, and he had a very clear agenda. So he basically became the de facto leader. And what he did right away was to create some weapons for the Commission of Public Safety to use to enforce its will. The first one of these was the Home Guard. So I mentioned that the Minnesota National Guard was being federalized, that is to say, it was being shipped out to training camps, and then eventually was going to be going to France. And so the National Guard was gone. And so to substitute for the National Guard, McGee organized the creation of what was called the Home Guard. And these were essentially businessmen's militias. So people who were not eligible for the draft, mostly businessmen in the cities and in towns, volunteered to become part of the Home Guard. And eventually there were 21 battalions around the state. And to augment the Home Guard, he also created what was called the Motor Corps, kind of part of the Home Guard. But this was businessmen who volunteered not only themselves, but also volunteered with their automobiles. And here they are at a training camp in Lake City. And, back in those days, the National Guard had a camp in Lake City, a training camp in Lake City. So they met there, at least a whole bunch of them did, in the summer of 1918 to practice various activities, for whatever they were going to be doing, which from the Commission for Public Safety's point of view was probably going to be things like breaking strikes, et cetera. And then there was also, the Commission for Public Safety could also count on the backing of most of the sheriffs in the state. Remember now, there was 86 counties at the time. Most of those sheriffs were ready to do whatever the Commission for Public Safety needed them to do. And then there were lots of patriotic organizations that also supported the Commission for Public Safety, with names like the Stars and Stripes League, the American First Association, et cetera, et cetera. But the one that was most important was called the American Protective League. So the American Protective League, it was an amazing organization. A man in Chicago, when the war was beginning, realized that the U.S. government, this is before the FBI, did not have many people out there investigating things. And so this guy created this American Protective League, which was basically an organization of volunteer detectives, amateur detectives, organized in every city. And he went to the Department of Justice and the Attorney General of the United States and said, we offer our services to you to hunt out slackers, people who are avoiding the draft, or people who are making seditious comments, or people who are not loyal in some way or another. And the U.S. government accepted. It was remarkable, and even authorized them to have these badges. American Protective League Secret Service, this was a captain's badge. It's kind of remarkable. These were completely unvetted guys who had no training, nothing, whatever. And in Minnesota, Minneapolis, the business community thought this was a great idea. They organized one in Minneapolis, eventually had about 250 amateur sleuths, and they even had an office, an official office in the federal building downtown, even though they were not official in any way. Well, I could say more about that, but I don't have time, so I'm going to keep talking about this afterwards, of course. Yes. So anyway, this all formed a network of resources that the Minnesota Commission for Public Safety had to enforce its code, and its code was really demanding 100% loyalty from the population, but also very much interested in protecting the economic interests of the business community. And those two kind of things got kind of melded together. So the book is about the sort of what happened, and then I want to just mention 4 kind of episodes, just very briefly, and they're all kind of talked about in much detail in the book, and they're interesting kind of set pieces in the book, but I just want to mention them so they kind of are turning points in the struggle. The first one happened in New Ulm. You may have heard about this. So New Ulm was and is a very German town, and the creation of the selective service system in the first month after the first couple months after the war was declared was a terrible thing for a town like New Ulm. So, you know, when war was declared, a lot of people weren't sure exactly what was going to happen. Basically, the U.S. was upset because it shipped some of its boats were being brought down by German U-boats, and people didn't realize it. Did Wilson actually intend to send an army to France? Well, yes, he did. Not only did he intend to send an army to France, but to build an army, which didn't exist at that time, with the selective service system, with a draft. And this was all kind of a shock to people, and suddenly it kind of happened that there would be a registration for the draft in June of 1917, and in July, the orders came in about how many men each county was going to have to provide for under the selective service system. In Germany, in New Ulm, this was very painful because people in New Ulm not only were mostly German Americans, but they had very close relations with their relatives back home in the old country. We used to say the old country when I growing up in Chicago. And some of them had, you know, just been visiting there. And they very well knew that people they knew and people they were closely related to, their uncles, their nephews, etc., were already on their way to the front lines. And so now if the young men of New Ulm were drafted and sent to France, it wouldn't just be like figuratively, it could be literally true that they would be shooting and maybe killing their own relatives. So this was a painful thing. And so there was a rally in July of 1917. Some of the young men asked the city leaders to, they took this idea that, well, we don't oppose the draft, we don't oppose the war, we don't like it, but we don't oppose it, but we think that it would make more sense, since this whole thing of having a draft is new, that there be that the draft only be applied, that people who are drafted not be sent abroad unless they volunteered to do that. Not opposing the draft, but opposing drafting people to send them abroad to fight in the war in another continent. And they kind of thought this was reasonable. And it wasn't actually that unreasonable. When Congress was debating the draft, it was actually seriously considering doing this because it was such a new thing. So they had this rally. People made speeches. Some of the speeches were a little more provocative than they intended to be. And the Commission for Public Safety came down really hard on them. So one of the powers that the Commission for Public Safety had was to actually remove elected people from office. And so they removed from office the mayor and the city attorney, Louis Fritchie and Albert Faender. And this was really kind of the beginning of the war at home. So now the Commission for Public Safety was kind of flexing its muscles, and they're saying, look, this is a problem. These Germans are out of hand. We have to do whatever. They also knew that these Germans were actually very much connected with more progressive movements like the Nonpartisan League. They didn't like that either. Now, I mentioned Louis Fritchie and Albert Faender because they're kind of interesting guys. You might think, oh, these guys were maybe some kind of pacifists or something. No. Both of these guys were officers in the Minnesota National Guard. Dr. Louis Fritchie, who was a doctor, was the second in command of the medical unit of the Minnesota National Guard. And Albert Faender was a major who had just led a battalion down to the Mexican border for 7 months. He had just gotten back when this happened because at that time, Wilson sent General Pershing down to chase Pancho Villa around Mexico, and he sent the National Guard to guard the border in case Pancho Villa came across. It was all kind of nuts. But anyway, they were down there for 7 months. So these guys were military guys, and they had fought in the Spanish-American War. You know, they were very much part of a military, very powerful military tradition in New Ulm. But the war with Germany was obviously something different. And they just wanted to see whether there could be a debate about it. Well, there couldn't. And this was the beginnings of the war at home. So people really started coming down on them, and things began to change. So then, let's see. The other thing that happened, of course, at this time was the kind of anti-immigrant backlash that had already been going on before World War I got much worse, especially against Germans. And so this is just a tiny little example of what that meant. Many people in the German-American community basically tried to take a lower profile. I mean, they supported the war, or at least they acquiesced to the war, but they were not really excited about it. And they were now getting a lot of backlash from all kinds of people in the community. So this was a bank. This is in Little Falls, Minnesota, right downtown in Little Falls, Minnesota. And you can see, if you look closely at this bank, that there was probably another word in the name of this bank. It's now called the American National Bank. And if you look really closely, and if we had more of a close-up, we could see it. There's even letters that were removed from this facade up here that can still be kind of read if you look really closely. What do you think that word was that was before where it said America? Yeah, it was the German-American National Bank. And so once the war began and things started going well, they sent some guy up there to take the GERMAN off the frieze there. And 100 years later, you can still see the outlines of those letters. But this was happening all over. It's kind of a typical part of the story. The second event I wanted to mention had to do with the Nonpartisan League. So now the Nonpartisan League, as I mentioned, has come into the state and is kind of pretty much saying, okay, we're going to try to do what we just did in North Dakota here in Minnesota. We're going to run for elections, et cetera. But the Nonpartisan League understood that Minnesota was not like North Dakota. We all know that. So in North Dakota, you could basically organize wheat farmers, and that would be enough to win an election. But in Minnesota, obviously the economy was much more diverse. There was more manufacturing, and even agriculture was much more diverse. And so they realized that they needed to reach out to figure out some sort of way of attracting votes outside of farmers, especially among the trade union movement. And so they held a big conference in St. Paul in September of 1917. It was called the Producers and Consumers Conference. And the idea was to talk about economic issues that the war had created, that farmers wanted to get a good price for their wheat, but workers wanted to have bread that they could afford. And so they wanted to build a coalition around these economic issues, and also about economic issues about how the war should be financed, which was very controversial. And so it was a big successful meeting, except they invited this guy to be their keynote speaker, Robert La Follette, Fighting Bob La Follette. So this made a lot of sense because La Follette was the leading progressive politician in the United States. And so very much in line with what the Nonpartisan League was trying to do. He also was well known as being one of the leading opponents of the U.S. declaration of war on Germany. And so he came, he gave a speech, he veered off a speech a little bit, got a little bit into talking about the war, et cetera. And all the newspapers just blasted the Nonpartisan League for having this disloyal American give this disloyal speech at their convention. And this was the beginning of a whole campaign by the Minnesota Commission for Public Safety and all the press against the Nonpartisan League as a disloyal, allegedly pro-German organization. And this was hammered home in a week, just a week later, when Teddy Roosevelt came to St. Paul. Just happened to be a week after La Follette had been here speaking. And Teddy Roosevelt was kind of went around saying that he hated the Huns, but he hated the shadow Huns just as much. And the shadow Huns, that is to say, the Huns at home, were people like La Follette and other people like the Nonpartisan League who were allegedly pro-German and against the war. So this is a newspaper. This is St. Paul Pioneer Press. St. Paul proves its loyalty as Roosevelt scores the Huns. 11,000 here, Colonel Flay LaFollette, 6,000 parade, 75,000 cheer marchers, etc. This is a huge event in St. Paul. And it also gives you a sense of what the major newspapers were like at this time. They were very much the pro-war, very much against the nonpartisan league, and there wasn't much division between the editorial page and the news pages. They're kind of all the same sort of thing. So this was now I just want to say this is a good time to mention, was the nonpartisan league pro-German or anti-war? Well, they certainly were before war was declared. And then, like everyone else, once war was declared, there was a difficult decision. You then had to say, okay, you could continue to oppose the war like part of the Socialist Party did, and then your people get sent to prison, etc. Or you can say, okay, we don't like the war, but we'll support the draft, we'll buy the Liberty bonds, and that's it. And that's what the nonpartisan league did. In North Dakota, they bought record numbers of Liberty bonds where the nonpartisan league was in charge. They also said that if it was okay to draft men and send them to France, from where they might not come back, then wouldn't it also be okay to conscript to finance the war? So to workers and farmers, this sounded like common sense, right? What's the problem with that? To the business community, this proved that the nonpartisan league was socialist. They wanted to conscript wealth to support the war. But from the worker point, was if you can conscript men, and then we actually might die or come back with one leg, why can't wealth be conscripted? So they kept making that argument, and that just got them in more trouble, at least with the business community. So this is what happened. So after this, it was like all the gloves were off in terms of dealing with the nonpartisan league. All around the state, many counties banned the nonpartisan league from campaigning, from organizing. There was a major investigation of the nonpartisan league. There was charges brought for sedition, that is to say, seditious speech against nonpartisan league leaders around the state. Things really got worse at that point. The third event I want to mention, and this is going to be really brief because this is a big, long, complicated story which cannot possibly be, but it happened right here in St. Paul, and that was a big transit strike. So in the fall of 1917, by the way, I should say, and you probably know this, that at that time there was the Twin Cities Rapid Transit Company, was a private company that ran the streetcars for the entire system. And it was an amazing system, all the way from Lake Minnetonka to White Bear Lake and Stillwater. It was an amazing thing, but it was privately owned. And so in 1917, some of the trainmen for the Twin Cities Rapid Transit Company started a union drive. And this, of course, was exactly what the whole business community was geared to stop, right? And so it turned out to be a huge battle. And the trade union movement in the Twin Cities got completely behind this, even to the extent of having a brief general strike in favor of the trainmen, but eventually the strike was lost. And they didn't get a union at that time. What happened was, among other things, that the Home Guard was mobilized. The Home Guard was from around the state, from Owatonna, Winona, et cetera, came to St. Paul to keep the streetcars running. Here you see the guys with their clubs and their pistols. They're kind of cold because it's December of 1917. And so the strike failed. However, this is a really important moment because the Nonpartisan League came to the aid of the trade union movement. And the trade union movement said, well, this is really interesting. This farmer organization is trying to help us out. And so this is like the beginning of this coalition between farmers, organized farmers and organized workers in Minnesota that in a couple of years was going to blossom into the Farmer Labor Party. Okay? So now, the last big event I want to mention. I've been saying all along that the Nonpartisan League was gonna run for election. So the Nonpartisan League was called the Nonpartisan League because of a tactic they used, which was running their candidates within the open primaries of the established parties, which usually meant the Republican Party in North Dakota or Minnesota because the Democrats were weaker. So in June of 1918, there was going to be a primary for the Republican Party for governor and for other state offices. So Governor Burnquist, the head of the Minnesota Commission for Public Safety, was running for re-election. He was going to be in the primary. And so the nonpartisan league decided to nominate a candidate to run against Burnquist in the Republican primary. And that candidate was this person, Charles A. Lindbergh Sr., the father of a guy who flew across the ocean in a plane, the father of the aviator. So Charles A. Lindbergh Sr. is a really important part of the Minnesota history. He was a legislator. He was from Little Falls. He was a lawyer of Little Falls. He represented Congress. He was in Congress for all those years, elected 5 times. And he, in Congress, was nationally well known. He was one of the leading kind of radical populists in Congress. And what he mainly was always focused on was trying to deal with the massive economic inequality in the United States. And primarily, from his point of view, the core of the problem was banking and what he called the money trust. That is the domination of the banking and credit system by the Wall Street bankers, J.P. Morgan, et cetera. So he worked on that issue as much as he could, and he had some things good that would happen and some things that he couldn't do. Eventually he kind of gave up and he retired from Congress. He didn't run again in 1916. He finished his term shortly before war was declared. He wasn't part of that decision in early 1917. And so he was available. He was very much kind of in tune with the nonpartisan league, and they nominated him as the candidate to run against Burnquist in this Republican primary. Burnquist, this is his campaign thing, Burnquist for governor, keep the party loyal. So Governor Burnquist said there's an issue in this election, and that is loyalty. So the nonpartisan league and Charles Lindbergh are traitors. They're pro-German. They're just, all they're doing is trying to help the Kaiser. You should never vote for them. You should only vote for me because I will keep the party loyal. That's all he wanted to talk about. So we had an election campaign all around the state where he would campaign with the local home guard. And he would talk about how loyalty is the main thing. It was very much an anti-immigrant campaign where he said that immigrants had to be really careful to be loyal. If they should be, they should lose the right to vote. They should have their property should be confiscated and they should be deported. This is his basic campaign speech. Meanwhile, Lindbergh was going around the state trying to campaign. And remember now, already for months and months, there had been a war in the nonpartisan league all around the state. Many states, many counties had banned the nonpartisan league from campaigning at all. And it was very difficult for Lindbergh to campaign. In Duluth, he was shut out completely, couldn't find a single hall to campaign in. And so sometimes they campaigned out at a farmer's field, on the back of a truck, etc. What really shocked me, and this is the thing that amazed me most in the research I did, was there was an amazing amount of animosity between the farmers, and this is best southern and northwestern Minnesota, actually all around the state, but between the farmers and the townspeople. And I mean, so what would happen is if the nonpartisan league would come into town with their cars and the Lindbergh's posters on the cars, townspeople come and rip them off, throw things at them. Sometimes there would be shots fired. There was all kinds of things. There was tons of violence between townspeople and farmers. And this kind of surprised me because I thought, aren't these two groups kind of mutually dependent on each other? But in the towns, there was this incredible fear and anger about the nonpartisan league. And it was just amazing how violent it was out there in the countryside. So in the last week of the campaign, one of the nonpartisan league's favorite kind of campaign tactics was to build a car caravan. Many farmers had cars and drive these big car caravans, sometimes several hundred cars around a county. And they would come into a town and have a little rally and move on. Well, when they came into a town, there was usually problems. And for example, when they came into Red Wing, the home guard had been called out and it was lining the streets with their bayonets to make sure that the nonpartisan league car caravan didn't stop and try to campaign. This is the way it went. It was actually remarkable. Many nonpartisan league leaders were under indictment, and actually Lindbergh was even indicted and charged and arrested with sedition a week before the election. It was just a kind of political stunt to try to show people that, see, he really is a pro-German traitor, We had to arrest him for it. Well, Burnquist won the election. It was really interesting. Lindbergh and the Nonpartisan League took 30 counties, and it's kind of interesting to see where they were, what counties that the Nonpartisan League was so strong that they actually had a majority. And you can see where they were, all in the Red River Valley, which was kind of wheat farmers that were pretty similar to the wheat farmers across the river in North Dakota, but many counties along the Minnesota River, where there was a lot of German American farmers who were members of the Nonpartisan League. You notice down the two tiers of counties along the Iowa border, but none of them had a majority. And of course, up in the Iron Range, obviously there wasn't much farming up there, so the Nonpartisan League hadn't really made much inroads there. Now, the Nonpartisan League actually thought this was pretty good because they had only been organizing in Minnesota for less than a year. They only had 50,000 signed up members, but they got 150,000 votes. Lindbergh got about 43% of the vote, even though he lost the election. Now, what was interesting to me was when I was able to look more closely at the vote totals by individual county, it's just remarkable what you find. Whether it's in the counties that Lindbergh won or the counties that Lindbergh lost, the rural counties, the votes in the towns are overwhelmingly for Burnquist. When I say overwhelming, I'd say like a vote might be 200 to 20. Right outside the town in the rural township, which was all farmers, completely switched. In fact, you could find townships that voted 100 to 1 for Lindbergh. It's just remarkable. It's like the town line was a huge thing, and that kind of was consistent with what I saw about the violence between the farmers and the townspeople. Now, what about the cities? So in the cities, you see from the map that Burnquist took both Hennepin County and Ramsey County. But in Minneapolis and St. Paul, Lindbergh swept all the wards that were basically working class wards. So you're probably curious about Ramsey County. Well, here it is. So Ramsey County was actually mostly St. Paul. Actually, Ramsey County was not a very big county. And you see the suburb vote was very small. There wasn't many suburbs. This is 1918. And so you see, first ward, second ward, this would be the east side, more working class wards. Lindbergh took them. The third and fourth ward was downtown, not many votes. That's why there's not many votes there. Fifth ward, I can't remember exactly where they were, but look at the seventh ward. 2,565 votes for Burnquist, 481 for Lindbergh. Now, what do you think the seventh ward was? No, not quite. Summit Avenue in the adjoining neighborhoods. So the middle class clearly understood what was going on, just like they did out in the rural areas where the townspeople voted for Burnquist and the farmers voted for Lindbergh. Here, the workers voted for Lindbergh and the middle class people voted for Burnquist. And you see in the seventh ward, it was really overwhelming. Now, this is kind of really, again, the Nonpartisan League failed, Lindbergh failed, but you see this class coalition coming together, which in the years after this will start having real successes. So in the 1920s, the Farmer Labor Party, which was basically the amalgam of the Nonpartisan League and trade union movement, was able to elect two senators, send two senators to Washington, and then throughout the 30s, were able to elect the governor, Floyd B. Olson and Elmer Benson. So it was really kind of an interesting moment. Now, I just want to say one more thing because I know I've gone pretty long. The other thing I tried to do in the book, besides sort of telling this story and what it means, is I'm really interested in how these big historic events affect individuals. And this is something really that we all have in common. You know, we, as Mark said, we all make history, but we don't make it just as we please. We're all born into some particular context. We might be white, we might be black, we might be rich, we might be poor. we might have been born in Gaza, we might have been born in Ukraine, and where we happen to be born and where we grew up obviously determines what we can do. We have free will, of course, but we're going to be limited or have great opportunities based on those factors, right? And so this is really something we all have in common. So I'm really curious about how something like a world war, how that affects individuals. And so in the book, I try to trace through some characters. And the major characters I follow a lot are first John McGee, because although most people have never heard of him, he was the most powerful man in Minnesota for 18 months, basically ran the state. And the second one was Charles Lindbergh Sr., because I think he's an enormously important, especially now, political figure that people should know about, but his memory has been kind of eclipsed by the memory of his son. So, I mean, if I say Charles Lindbergh to you, what do you think, right? That's the way it is. And, but Charles Lindbergh, that's why we're talking about Charles Lindbergh Sr., important person to know about. So there's a lot in the book about them. But I just want to say very quickly that I mentioned some of the other characters that I mentioned because they bring to light a number of other things that are going on in the book that I haven't had a chance to talk about. So I'll just mention these really quickly. Jens Grandal, really interesting character. He was the editor of the Red Wing Daily Republican. And kind of a typical small town newspaper editor. He started off being kind of into neutrality, not very much into the war. Once the war started, he became a flaming nationalist and started writing editorials about who should be hung. And I mean, it's an amazing thing to watch. But this thing about small town newspapers is really interesting. You know that there were 750 newspapers in Minnesota in 1918? It's amazing. It's a really interesting area that's really been very little studied. Secondly, Maria Sanford, some of you might recognize that name. She's a legendary professor at the University of Minnesota, and kind of an example for me of progressive intellectuals who were not interested in the war at all, but once the war began, decided to kind of buy into it. And buy into it in the sense of buying into Woodrow Wilson's idea that this would be the war to end all wars. This is the war to save democracy. And so people like Maria Sanford said, oh, okay, they became big supporters of the war based on that kind of idea. And she died in 1918 and didn't get to see how that didn't really turn out so well. But anyway, that's what happened. Alice Ames Winter was the head of the Women's Commission of the Minnesota Commission for Public Safety. So you may know that in those days, all the common organizations in every town, you know, the Masons and the Odd Fellows and the Red Men, whatever, they usually had a women's auxiliary. And the Minnesota Commission for Public Safety did the same thing. And she ran the women's auxiliary, except she was kind of an independent soul and ran it in a little bit of an independent sort of way. So kind of an interesting character. Clarence Wigington, very famous St. Paul person, famous architect, and things that he designed on the National Register, you can see all through St. Paul. But he was in the book because the U.S. military and the Minnesota National Guard and the Home Guard here in Minnesota were all completely segregated. There's a whole bunch in the book about the segregation of the military and all that went on during that time. And so in 1918, Clarence Wigington and some other middle-class African Americans here in St. Paul and Minneapolis petitioned to create a African American unit of the Home Guard. It was called the 16th Battalion. And he, sometimes you see Clarence Wigington referred to as Cap Wigington because he was the captain of one of the companies in that 16th Battalion. Anyway, so this is part of, from the point of view of people like Wigington, having a 16th Battalion, an African American battalion, was still a segregated battalion, but they saw it as a way of kind of cracking open the door a little bit of Jim Crow, Minnesota, by having at least an African American battalion. So that's a whole other interesting story. Sarah Terrell Colvin was a woman from the women's movement supporting suffrage, but what happened when World War I broke out is that the women's movement split. Part of the women's movement decided to support the war. Sarah Colvin was part of the other part of the women's movement, the Women's Party, that said, wait a minute, if Woodrow Wilson says we have to go to Europe to support democracy, shouldn't he be supporting democracy here at home first by supporting the suffrage amendment? So they picketed at the White House, and Sarah Colvin was arrested at least twice in front of the White House for these pickets. And finally, Ambrose Teague was a power lawyer here in St. Paul, and he was the person who wrote the statute that created the Commission for Public Safety, and then it was its general counsel. And so he was a really important part of this whole story. And after the war, he had a very successful, continued to have a very successful career. He was one of the founders of William Mitchell College of Law, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he got more and more wealthy and successful, got a nice mansion on Summit Avenue. And then on the 10th anniversary of the armistice, this would have been on November 11th, 1928, he shot himself in his home on Summit Avenue. And you obviously can't make anything of that, in particular why people commit suicide, but it was interesting for me to find out that although he was like one of the main people who kind of created this whole Commission for Public Safety and acted kind of as one of its major henchmen, he clearly had second thoughts about how far it had gone and seemed to be unsettled by what had happened with the war. So at the end of the book, I have this section called Lives After Wartime. It's kind of my favorite part of the book, where I see what happened to various people I've been following through in the years after the war. And it ends with Ambrose Teague's tragic death. And that's the end of my story for today. And I hope we have some questions. I hope I still have some time. Sorry, we spoke too much. Okay.
There was a lot to absorb.
Yeah.
Audience, I would really invite you to ask questions of Greg.
So
yes,
really that I bought your book. I started reading it, not really going to finish it tonight. But the question is, how do we get from the end of World War I to say around the beginning of World War II? And of course, you could say that Charles Lindbergh Jr. was just going to follow his father's footsteps. He was an isolationist. He was pro-German. Way.
Yeah.
And that's how I'll send your book out.
Well, it is, but I've thought about that. And so here's what he's asking is a very good question. So obviously, Charles Lindbergh Sr. was an opponent of U.S. entry to the war against Germany in 1917. And then in the 1938-39, Charles Lindbergh Jr., who by this time, after he flew across the Atlantic in 1927, became an international celebrity. But not only did he become an international celebrity after he flew across the Atlantic, but he very quickly got connected with some of the wealthiest people in the world. So he married Anne Morrow Lindbergh, who was, her father was a partner of J.P. Morgan, et cetera. So pretty soon he was really operating in the upper class, among the 1%. And so, but then in 1937, he became the spokesman for this thing called the American First Committee, which was opposed to the U.S. entering the war against Germany, against Nazi Germany, and very much an opponent of FDR, who was trying to do the opposite, et cetera. So a very good question is that, well, didn't the son, wasn't he just following in his father's footsteps? And my answer is no, because Lindbergh Jr. is an interesting character. I mean, if you read his memoirs about growing up, there was a time when his father was campaigning, when his father asked him, he pulled him out of school even and asked him to drive his father's car around the state as Charles Lindbergh Sr. was campaigning. And Charles Lindbergh Jr. was very happy to do this, not because he had any interest in his father's politics, but because he loved driving that car around the state. I mean, what he was mostly into was machines, car machines and airplane machines and air travel, whatever. So I had a good time doing that. I even passed out literature for my father, but I never listened to his speeches. I mean, I really had no interest in that. And very clearly, he never really imbibed any of the radical populism of his father. And then we find him in 1938 hanging out with the wealthiest of the wealthiest and starting to talk in a different kind of language. And the reason he says that the U.S. should not enter the war against Germany is because, after all, the U.S. and Germany are both white nations, and white nations shouldn't be fighting each other because, the yellow peril is coming over the horizon, and all we white people need to stay together. This is actually, people sometimes say the problem with Charles Lindbergh Jr. was that he made an anti-Semitic speech. That was the least of his problems. His basic problem was he operated under this fundamentally racial hierarchy. And this is one of the reasons why the Nazis didn't bother him so much, because they talked, they talked to the same kind of language. So I would say, that's why I would say no. And I mean, they happen to have proposed wars against Germany, but for completely different reasons. And the fact that their father and son is, I mean, it's just, that's the way it is. Anyway, but thanks for the question. Anyway, probably not everyone would agree with that either, so I should say that too. But anyway, yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, sure. Oh,
yeah. Yeah.
So, after the 2-year period, rule was kind of decided.
Yeah.
I think what happened,
Yeah, so I mean, one thing that's really good to say about what happened then, which is actually why the current situation seems to be so much worse, is that when the armistice happened in November of 1918, the Commission for Public Safety pretty much decided that its time was up, and they kind of wrapped things up because their mandate was for the course of the war, and also because the legislature was going to reconvene, and it really didn't make any sense for them to continue. However, obviously in the business community, there was a big interest in trying to institutionalize some of the gains they made. So they said, well, wait a minute, let's keep the Home Guard, or let's keep the Motor Corps or whatever. And there was lots of debate in the legislature about that. And the trade unions rose up and said, no, because the trade unions said, look, the Home Guard and the Motor Corps basically about stopping us. So we don't want them. And even the and so the idea was to try to fold those things into the Minnesota National Guard. The Minnesota National Guard came back from the war and they said, well, we don't really want all those volunteers in there. I mean, that's not what we want. And so basically those things kind of fizzled. But there was a real attempt to, basically, in general, in the country, there's a huge rightward turn in 1920. So the election of Harding, et cetera, the return to normalcy, et cetera, and also just horrendous violence in 1919 and 1920, racial violence and labor union struggles, the Palmer raids, et cetera. This was really rough times. And so it's kind of amazing in Minnesota that really at that very same time, the Farmer Labor Party is starting to come together and even able to win some elections in the 20s, because generally speaking, throughout the country, the things were really shifting very much to the right then. Yeah.
To the Minneapolis Socialist Government, just for 2 years.
Yeah, so they managed to. I mean, it was a big part of what they were trying to do is to unelect him, and so they managed to do it. So he just won by a small margin in 1916. He lost by a small margin in 19. He ran again and lost again, and it was just never able. So the problem, the Socialist Party situation is very confusing because, not confusing. Like I say about everything, it's complicated. So when the war broke out, the Socialist Party was pretty strong in those days. Not so much in Minnesota, but in some places it was much stronger than here. But what happened when the war broke out is the Socialist Party nationally had a big emergency meeting, and the majority voted to oppose the war. And then there was a minority that voted against doing that, criticizing the war, but saying we needed to support it. But the majority voted against the war and basically said we're going to go into a position of complete opposition to the war, which meant opposition to the draft, opposition to everything. And that was a big problem because many people in the Socialist Party were then indicted and went into prison. Tom Van Leer was in the minority view. So he was actually part of the minority that said, yeah, the war is a bad idea, but now that it's happened, we have to go along with it and we'll wait for a better day. But what he wouldn't do, he said that it was on the minority view, but he would not repudiate the party completely. So they kept hammering away at him on that, and eventually I think that's what brought him down in 1918. So it's interesting because like in Milwaukee, They elected a socialist mayor there, who I think he was a mayor for like 20 years. It was quite an amazing thing. I mean, what these socialists want to do, this is why the whole thing with Mamdani in New York is so interesting, is that this thing called municipal socialism or sewer socialism. You know, people say, well, how did Tom really get elected to begin with? Because he said very clearly, I'm a socialist, I want to have a socialist revolution. In the short run, what I really want to do is to get you all a better deal with the Twin Cities Rapid Transit Company. So the Twin Cities Rapid Transit Company's contract was coming up. And what the contract would be for the concession to basically run, you know, was how that was set would affect how the fares would be for ordinary people for the next, whatever, 3 or 4 years. And so Van Leer, that was one of his main things. We're going to fight to get a better contract with the Twin Cities Rapid Transit Company so that when you get to go to work, your fares will be lower. And that's the kind of thing he campaigned on. Unfortunately, as soon as he got elected, there was the war. And the war was unavoidable. And it was a problem. So anyway, it's complicated, like I say. Yes.
Well, I don't know. It's just that I could listen to this all night, but this is my weird niche in history as well. So I wrap us up. I think we can certainly hang around in the room and talk to each other.
And talk to each other.
Wanted to ask in person, that would be fantastic.
And there are books to be bought, hopefully. And I just want to say one thing before. Let's, you know, one of the reasons why this is really important to me is that it's really hard to publicize a serious book about Minnesota history. For example, do you think that the Minnesota Star Tribune would ever review a book like mine? No, they would never review a book like that. I mean, and so it's just really hard getting the word out. And so I really appreciate people coming and doing this. And so here's what I would say. If you are so inclined, if you read the book and have something to say about it, you can go to Goodreads, for example, and publish a review. A review can just be a sentence or two. If you happen to buy the book on Amazon, you can write a review on Amazon. You have to buy it from Amazon to write a review from Amazon. But otherwise, on Goodreads, you could do anything. And I'm told by the publisher that those kind of things help because it's really hard. It's really an uphill climb. And so I really appreciate this kind of thing and the Friends for.
Also a finalist for the Minnesota Book Award in Minnesota Nonfiction. And that I think will help a great deal.
Yeah, and
that list gets posted in libraries around the state.
Right. And I'm really happy about that. And it's the Minnesota Book Award is a wonderful thing because it's so much geared towards helping publicize books. So you choose the 4 finalists in January, and we have 3 or 4 months to try to publicize all the finalists for all the categories. It's really a wonderful program, and I'm so happy I'm a finalist. Thank you very much.
So happy.
Okay. Thanks a lot, folks.
Very well, fine.